And we'll begin with the suspect who attempted to storm the White House Correspondents' Dinner over the weekend. He is now expected to be arraigned in federal court this morning. Authorities say the man, whose name is Cole Allen, could face federal firearm and assault charges. The Department of Justice may also file more charges ahead of the hearing. FBI agents searched Allen's home in Torrance, California, just hours after the attack. Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche says the suspect was apparently targeting administration officials, likely including President Trump. As MS Now reporter Nick McCool explains, investigators are looking into a letter allegedly written by Allen and sent to his family just minutes before the attack.
Less than 48 hours after this chaotic scene at the White House Correspondents' Center, we're learning more about the suspect allegedly behind the attack.
He was probably a pretty sick guy.
The suspect is Cole Allen of the Los Angeles area, according to one former senior law enforcement official briefed on the matter. A LinkedIn profile in the suspect's name says he went to Caltech and is a trained engineer, working at a college prep organization that once posted they named him Teacher of the Month.
What we believe happened, at least as of now, is that the suspect traveled by train from Los Angeles to Chicago and then Chicago to Washington, D.C., where he checked into the hotel where the Correspondents' Center was at in the last day or two.
Surveillance video showing the suspect running past authorities before being taken down. They say he charged a security checkpoint, carrying a shotgun and a handgun, as well as knives.
He has clear sense of what he wants to do and how he's going to carry it out.
The New York Post has published a note attributed to the suspect, calling himself a, quote, friendly federal assassin, and saying he was targeting members of the Trump administration. James Allen Fox is a criminologist at Northeastern University.
Perpetrators like this do not want to be seen as just some nut who went off the deep end and killed for no reason at all. He has a reason. He wants us to know it.
After the attack, President Trump sitting down for an interview with 60 Minutes.
How worried were you that there were going to be injuries?
I wasn't worried. I understand life. We live in a crazy world.
An iconic D.C. event left forever changed in an era of political violence.
We're going to do it again. We're not going to let anybody take over our society.
The Secret Service said the one officer who was hit has already been released from the hospital, saved by a ballistic vest. And all of this comes as King Charles and Queen Camilla are set to begin their official state visit to the U.S. today. Back to you.
MS Now's Nick McCool with that report. Let's bring in MS Now national security and intelligence analyst Christopher O'Leary. He's a former senior FBI official who served in the Bureau's counterterrorism division and as the U.S. government's director of hostage recovery. Chris, good to see you. Let's start with the questions about security at that site. Now, we should stipulate something very clearly off the top. The gunman was stopped a full level above where President Trump was. There was a lot of security between where he was eventually apprehended and the dais with the dignitaries. He wasn't that close, but obviously he posed a real danger to other people in the area. The hotel is public. The hotel remains open for guests. Even as this dinner is held down in the massive ballroom in the basement. What are some things that strike you about vulnerabilities?
Yeah, so I think from the Secret Service's standpoint, their security plan worked. You know, their priority is the president, the vice president, and other protectees that they have responsibility for, and they were able to successfully evacuate them. Now, they are the best in the world at this, but, you know, protecting these high-threat principles is always a challenge. So they are going to be very self-critical. They'll assess what went well, what went poorly, and they'll make adjustments. The broader question is the venue security and the vulnerability of other people that were there. And certainly, this individual should not have been able to run at a full sprint through the magnetometer area because action is faster than reaction. And as you can see, even though the law enforcement officers in Secret Service Uniform Division did react, the assailant was already past them. And then the one thing that comes to mind, having spent a lot of time overseas, thank God this individual was not a suicide bomber, because we'd be talking about hundreds of casualties right now if he would have gone that route. So certainly things need to be changed, harden this target, maybe look at this if it repeats itself as a national security event and bring additional resources and back the initial, outer cordon up outside of the hotel. But again, there's always going to be a vulnerable point, that first, point of contact where a subject can get to.
Yeah, and presidents' public schedules are usually pretty guarded, only released a short time in advance. But this is the rare public event where people knew exactly when and where it's held, and that the president, he announced weeks ago that he was going. So this would be someone could plan to hit. And let me ask you that, Chris, on that idea that, unfortunately, we have seen a real rise in political violence. There have been a number of assassination attempts on President Trump. We have seen lawmakers on both sides of the aisle targeted by extremists on both sides of the political spectrum. Just as you think about this, as public figures going forward, what other adjustments, sadly, may they all need to make?
Well, the biggest adjustment is leadership by example, turning the temperature down quite a bit, because leaders do set an example, whether it's a good example or a bad example. And if there's toxic leadership and hyperpolarization in the United States, with social media and disinformation out there and conspiracy theories, vulnerable people might think this is a rational act and might turn towards violence. I mean, we've seen periods of it, not only in the United States, but I'll point back to the 1800s. The real advent of assassination as a tool started in the 1800s by an Italian anarchist who tried to assassinate Napoleon III. He failed, but it was called the Orsini affair. He had this rudimentary hand grenade, but that was replicated time and time again. And leaders from France, Spain, Italy, ultimately President McKinley, were assassinated by anarchists. And then Teddy Roosevelt, there was an attempt on his life. And most notably, World War I started from Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian anarchist, assassinating Archduke Ferdinand. So the idea that assassination was an effective tool became something that became the norm. Then in the United States, we had instability in the United States and political grievances in the late 60s and through the 70s. And we had violence across the United States. Bombings were routine in the United States. And certainly we had assassinations between Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy and George Wallace attempts against President Ford. So the idea when you have a political grievance and you've tried everything else, people turn towards political violence more often not because they have a mental defect, which a lot of people like to immediately go to, but from their perspective, they've tried other things, whether it's using their vote, whether it's petitioning, whether it's protesting, and they feel voiceless. And often these people turn towards political violence because they think it's a rational act, not because they have a mental defect.
Terrific insight there. MS Now national security and intelligence analyst, former senior FBI official Chris O'Leary. Chris, thank you again for joining us this morning. So, David Rowe, tell us what we know about this suspect, as we heard from Nick McCool there a few minutes ago. A manifesto apparently was discovered, sent to family members and in which he did lay out some of his reasoning for what he was about to do. Tell us what we've learned.
So he went to Caltech. It's one of the toughest schools in the country to get in. Brilliant. There's a lot of great reporting out there by our colleagues and others about, he was a good teacher. He was liked on campus, and people expressing shock at this. To his credit, it's the family member, as Chris said, that he sent out this message that went out, and his brother, who I think lives near here up in Connecticut, immediately sent it to law enforcement officials. But his rationale was that he had to act to stop President Trump. He called him a traitor. He called him a pedophile. That term, as you saw yesterday in the Norah O'Donnell interview, really infuriates the president. And to be fair, there is no credible allegation of Donald Trump abusing children, but this kind of thing circulates online. So we'll learn more. There's not much information about if he's spoken or said much to authorities, but it's just another example of our polarization and rising political violence.
Yeah, associations with Jeffrey Epstein, I think, the heart of that.
Yeah.
Rev, firsthand about political violence. What worries you about, unfortunately, a trend that only seems to be increasing?
Yeah, I do know firsthand. I was stabbed once leading a march, and I think the responsibility on all sides is to appeal to people that you can disagree without being disagreeable and certainly not being deadly. And even if you wanted strategically to make a point, you hurt your own cause, because now the example I could give today, they're going in court to appeal in Virginia, a judge stopping the will of the voters that voted last week, yes, on the redistricting. All we're talking about today is the his attempt assassination of some of the Trump people. You have taken the focus off of the things that we're aggrieved about, assuming that's what he was aggrieved about. So it's not even tactically right as much as it is morally reprehensible. And when President Trump said the other night that people on all sides need to agree to not deal with violence, and I agree with President Trump on that. At least he took that position. I hope all of us will take that position that, wait a minute, we're talking about fighting nonviolently or dealing with the issues, not dealing with this kind of inciting anyone to do this. I don't know. I checked with some of the people in California National Action Network. I don't know any of his activism. I don't think he was an activist. So I don't know his motive, but I know the results are not helpful to those of us that are trying to deal with Trump's agenda that has been, in my opinion, detrimental to most Americans.
And Elise, there have been questions now for some years whether this dinner needs to go away, and questions about its appropriateness. But it is, let's be clear, a high-profile event. And it adds to, even though this would-be assassin was unsuccessful, and thankfully no one was really hurt, it adds to this feeling of sort of tumult and chaos in the country right now, political violence being part of it, where people just feel like things aren't the way they're supposed to be.
Well, absolutely. And you look at all of the high-profile events that have happened, and President Trump has been targeted. There was Butler. There was the incident at the golf course. Now this. And it does raise serious questions about presidential security in this era of political violence, when both sides have become so radicalized that there are the fringe actors who are willing to turn to violence. And you can see that in empirical studies. Robert Pape at University of Chicago was on our show last night and was talking about the rise in political extremism in the country. And it is a devastating trend that we have to get a handle on so that the fringe does not become more of a force.
Completely right. Should be denounced by all parties. All right.